Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So I want to talk a bit today about when to bug in and when to bug out in the case of civil unrest. And I'm going to be referencing for this video the case of the McCloskeys versus protesters. And the interesting thing in this case, which probably shouldn't be overlooked, and as far as I can tell from the video footage and based on what the McCloskeys themselves have said, they actually pointed their firearms at white protesters. So I think that should be something that people should keep in mind as well. Not to say that makes it better or worse, but perhaps that can alleviate some fears that this was a racially motivated thing. You know, we don't know what transpired off camera, once again. So it's not my intent here to judge anybody within this story. All we know is that these protesters breached private property and the McCloskeys exercise their right to defend themselves with the castle doctrine. And as such, as far as I know, they have the right to protect themselves using firearms in that state with lethal force. Now, there's a lot to be said about trigger discipline and muzzle control and a lot of the things that the McCloskeys probably did wrong in this scenario that most Second Amendment activists, firearm enthusiasts, and firearms trainers would agree was just done wrong. Now, it's easy to judge people from the outside and say, well, you should have did this and you should have did that. In a situation where adrenaline is high, and maybe you've been watching, reports on the news of rioting and looting going on, and of course now you see that your private property has been breached. Obviously, adrenaline is going to be high, and if you don't have a lot of training, you're probably going to be doing this kind of thing. You're probably going to be waving that gun around in a less than ideal manner, which may even be hysterical at some points in this video, where you're directly pointing the firearm at a person. And from the perspective of the laws of that state, you should never point a firearm at somebody unless you intend to use it or unless they are a direct lethal threat to you at that time. So I think that's where obviously she made the mistake. And of course, both of their muzzle control was terrible. He had her painted half the time. It may have been the camera angle on the video, but both of them were swinging that gun around, and they easily, if they were in fact loaded, which I'm presuming they were, they could easily have hurt one of themselves, in addition to one of the protesters. Now, some people might criticize them and say you should have never came out of your home in the first place, brandishing firearms in an aggressive manner. But I guess, to their defense in this respect, and once again, this is all heat of the moment type stuff, I can imagine a scenario where they thought that, their property was going to be ravaged. And, it's kind of like a critical mass sort of thing where if people start coming onto the lawn, then it doesn't take them that long to get into the house. Then all of a sudden somebody throws something through the window and then it's pretty much on, right? So these things, once they spiral out of control, it's very hard to get them under control. And perhaps that was their mindset at the time, that, we don't want this to go further than the perimeter of our actual property, even though the entire area was private property. So I'm sure that's how, in their minds at the time anyways, they justified that more offensive approach. Now, I understand the strategy of defensively posturing and showing that you have the means to protect yourself in a very direct way, so to stop any initial infringement which might escalate into, a full-blown riot on their property. I understand that through and through. But where I think they made the mistake, obviously, was when they started pointing the firearm at people. And obviously, I don't think the husband pointed the firearm, but the wife sure did. And that was very, very irresponsible and dangerous. And even if you believe fully that they had every right to point guns at people who are on their property, which you may, there's another aspect of personal protection that they are not paying attention to. Number one, if even a few people within that crowd had weapons or had access to weapons, then they open themselves up to a big problem. Then they're going to find themselves in a gunfight. And judging by the woman's lack of footwear and their lack of trigger discipline and muzzle control, clearly they weren't prepared enough to deal with a crowd of that magnitude in that sort of way. And in addition to that, obviously they've now gained notoriety. So they've not only been doxxed heavily, meaning that their address has been disclosed, and obviously their reputations have come under scrutiny. Even as many people have been supporting them, I don't doubt that they've now received some threats. Now, if they were just open carrying in a ready position, that would allow them to engage if they needed to, but not directly pointing guns at people, not rattling the hornet's nest at all. If they were doing that, then I think that would be far more ideal for everybody's safety in that situation, including their own. And they may have been less of a meme had they just done that. But it's likely that, the media would have taken this and run with it one way or another anyways, but perhaps a bit less so and more favorably had they done that instead. Then this may have not been as controversial, and in fact many more people would have sympathized what they were going through, and they wouldn't have put their careers and their lives in jeopardy henceforth after all of this had transpired. Now, they may make the argument that they needed to exhibit that degree of aggression in order to prevent the situation from escalating. It didn't appear that it was that intense on the brief video footage that we've seen, but then again, we are not there. We don't know what the atmosphere is. We don't know what the intent of the protesters were, or the rioters, whatever you want to call them, or the people who were trespassing were. But I think with better training, this situation could likely have been resolved much better in such a way which didn't necessarily put them in the limelight, because now they made themselves out to be a very big target. So at what cost has defending their home in this manner brought to them? That's just a conversation that I think needs to be had. It's not my place to say whether it was right or wrong what happened. Like I said, adrenaline happens, and of course here in Canada, if you were to do something like this, you would likely immediately go to jail, because our laws are much different. You can only ever do something like this if you feel as though your life is in danger and that you are actually in fear of losing your life. But if from a strategic standpoint, pointing a firearm like that at people when you don't intend to use it in a very hysterical manner, that doesn't seem like the optimal way to handle this situation. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. The McCloskeys themselves weren't hurt. So at least in the short term, their reactive approach, which, like I said, it lacked a lot of fundamental aspects of firearms training, seemed to have worked. But in the long term, it's probably going to bring a lot more stress for them than it was worth. Now, let's talk about where they're living in the first place. Now, a lot of people will say you shouldn't live in the city because this kind of stuff can happen in instances of civil unrest. Myself personally, I would never be caught dead in a house that looked like that big in the city this day and age. I would take the Warren Buffett approach. You buy yourself a $680,000 home. You're one of the richest men in the world. You don't flaunt it. If you want to don this level of material affluence in today's current climate, then by all means, go ahead. That is absolutely your right to do so. But just be prepared to defend it from hundreds of people who may now come back with a vengeance. In this case, you were able to do so, but unless you have a private security firm or something, or some means, or some larger group that could help you defend a property like this, in my personal opinion, you can count me out. I'm more so going to take the gray man approach when it comes to where I choose a home, but that said, to each their own. You got a really big target on your back this day and age when there's a lot of people who are out of work. Some of them ain't got nothing to lose, and you got a whole lot to lose. That's not a situation you want to be in, or you can be in that situation, but you can be in it far more strategically, where you are strategically relocated to a place which is going to be lower risk. I made a video on strategic relocation. You can check that out here. Now, it's easy to echo the advice of the all-American prepper and just say, yeah, you should, uproot your entire life and move out of the city, and then you have to drive to work every day for an hour, and you got to take your kids out of school, and they got to go to some, rural school, or else you got to homeschool them. It's very easy to say that everybody should just move to a rural environment. It's much easier said than done, because a lot of people have jobs within the cities, or they rely on larger populations to run their businesses, or whatever the case might be. So I understand, how hard it can be to do that, but I think that should be the long-term goal of anybody who is in the preparedness mindset to at least try to remove yourself from places of very, very high population density. And especially if you find yourself in a palace like this, but you're going to have to live with this kind of civil unrest when people come knocking. Now, in terms of bugging in or bugging out in a scenario like this, here is the real danger which could potentially present itself. Now that the protesters know that they're going to be met with this kind of resistance, what's to say that they're not going to bring armaments to these protests in the future? Now, most of these protests, I should say, are peaceful. However, this one, they were breaching private property. So once you do that, then you, of course, are trespassing. But who's to say now that this isn't going to up the ante with regards to how these protests are conducted? And what happens when other people start, to brandish firearms back? Is that how this is all going to escalate? And then at that point, then, that's when you need to have a bug out plan if you live in the cities. I've done a lot of videos on bugging out from the cities, from an urban environment. You can go and check those videos out. But what I worry about now, as these trials go forth through the election season, and it could be a perfect storm of events as the election approaches, to have these trials ongoing. And if people start to suspect that the verdict is going to go one way or another, and if it doesn't go away that they like, and you have incidences like this up until that point that are getting more intense, eventually people are going to start bringing more weapons and more protective equipment to these things, and it could just potentially escalate really quickly. And in that case, it doesn't matter how many firearms you have. If you're facing a mob of hundreds of people, you would ultimately be overrun at some point, unless you had incredible training, which these people, I'm assuming, didn't have, or at least they just didn't have the stress inoculation training to manage their adrenaline at the time, which would allow them to execute that training. So definitely, if you live in a city and if you find yourself in a big McMansion like this actually wasn't a McMansion, this was a real mansion, so they've done quite well for themselves. But you got to be careful with how you react in those situations. There's a lot of value to being a gray man and staying in the house unless people are crossing onto your property and it is escalating to that point where you feel like that the threat is imminent and you have to do something to put yourself in the way of the threat. And that may well have been the case in this instance. Like I said, we only have believe half of what you see and none of what you hear, and we can only believe half of what we see in this video because we don't know the entire story. We don't know what transpired afterwards or before. Now, if she were to have shot somebody either accidentally or intentionally, there's a few things that could have happened. People could have rushed them and they could have kept on shooting, and that could have been a total disaster. Or people in the crowd could have started firing back, or everybody would have ran out of there and you would have seen all over the news and they would have been in handcuffs, and it would just been a huge divisive controversy which would have flared up all of the protests once again and led to even more riots, and I'm sure their home would have been ransacked. It just really would have escalated had she accidentally slipped. So this could have ended very, very badly with respect to how they responded. Now, unfortunately, due to provocations on both sides and both sides' reluctance to really engage in any real civil dialogue, it would appear. I've seen it happen on some forums, but 90% of it is just adding fuel to the fire, it would seem. You have to be realistic about how this could possibly end. And you have to have an escape plan if you do live in the cities, whether you're a person who lives in the inner cities and you're a small business along a strip that might be subject to more rage this summer, or if you live in one of these suburban gated communities. That's one of the problems with the gated community, is that it's as hard to get out as it is to get in to a lot of these places, especially if you want to pack up all your gear and leave in a vehicle. You've kind of boxed yourself in. So that's one of the downsides of living in a gated community. That's why I would never personally live in a gated community. I would choose the country 9 times out of 10 over a gated community, but I can understand why some people do want to live there because, like I said, it's close to their jobs. But myself personally, I would never be caught in a vain mansion like this. That's just too much house for me personally. I'm a simple person. So from a preparedness standpoint, you don't want a house like that unless you have an army to defend it, which clearly they did not. Anyways, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section, guys. Please keep it civil. Please keep it constructive. The point of this channel is to diffuse tensions, not to escalate tensions. Unlike many channels out there, my intent is not to provoke and make matters worse for anybody on any side of the argument. The point of this channel is to help people stay safe when the shit hits the fan. Thanks for watching, guys. Canadian Prepper out. The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. Your one-stop shop for premium, high-quality, brand-name products that have been tried and tested by myself and other YouTube gear reviewers. My subscribers save 10% off by using the coupon code SURVIVALPREPPER. All one word in all caps.